Okay, thank you very much. So thank you to Heloise and Tracey, who've come from the National Maritime Museum. I don't know if people here know the museum very well, but Britt Lenser and various guises and people here have been involved in some of the recent exhibitions that have been held and various other activities there. This project is particularly interesting, looking for Lascars. Heloise and Tracey are going to begin with a 20-minute slideshow of some of the archived material that you've got, and then you're going to open it out to some short questions and answers and discussions around what you've got and introduce the project as well. Okay, so thank you very much.
My name's Heloise Finch-Boyer. I'm one of the curators at the National Maritime Museum. My area of expertise is French colonial history in Mauritius and Reunion. So I would like to say from the outset, I'm not an expert on Lascars, British history, Indian history, or maritime history. So why I'm here is because I've got quite a good nose for a story and quite a good nose for research. So I've been digging in the archives, but one of the reasons that I've been involved in this project is to try and get some expertise from other members of the communities to fill in the gaps. So I found some stuff with Tracey. Tracey Weller is Archive Learning Officer at the National Maritime Museum. And we've been going through the archives for a whole year, every week. The National Maritime Museum is a museum, but it also has archives of many, many different things to the Navy, the Merchant Navy, various people's papers, all sorts of stuff. So we've gone and hunted. This is what we found, we're going to show you, but we're not experts in the history that it represents. So that's where we need input from you or people that you may know that might be able to fill in some of the gaps. And that will also explain that there may be questions that I might not be able to answer because this is not my geographical area of knowledge, really. So, for any of you has anyone been to the National Maritime Museum with a show of hands vaguely? Oh, that's good. Oh, that's pretty good. So, most of you hopefully should know that it's in Greenwich. As we know, British Empire, Britain was mostly everywhere in the globe at some point over the last 500 years. But the type of history that has been presented there, and the type of history it's very easy to find, is white officers. So white naval officers, very easy to go and search about admirals and wigs and famous people's battles. Much harder to find ratings or the sailors. It's harder again to find people that weren't born in Britain and find out their histories. But as many of you will know, British maritime world extended the globe, and it included a lot of people from a lot of different countries in work, in supplying ships, in having relationships with people on board the ships, all sorts of things. So there's a whole untold story. And as this picture shows, what we mostly see at the Maritime Museum is a lot of white officers, but you just have to look a bit closely and you might find somebody from somewhere else. So this is what we've been doing. For somebody coming very new to the subject of South Asian sailors, what I found in the literature or the other historians that have written about it, and for accounts at the time, is they kind of tend to portray South Asian sailors in two ways. Either as very, very patriotic, the picture of very patriotic, there'll always be a red ensign or a Union flag somewhere in the shop to say these people are really British fundamentally. Or there's a portrayal of South Asian sailors as somehow savage or not quite British, not quite white enough. And I think this picture of people eating on deck portrays something of these people really aren't like British ratings, they eat the different way, and it's not particularly positive. And if those who've read the little quote that came from an account, the idea is that people that are not white British males are somehow less good in battle, somehow more prone to panic, all of these type of portrayals. So these are standard tropes that we can see if we go into some very available pictures. This picture is available online to buy. And so Tracey and I really had a dig to see what else we could find.
We keep talking about digging and finding and searching. One of the things about the Maritime Museum collections is not only does it contain the histories of a lot of white European people, it's also been, on the whole, catalogued by white European people. So often histories that aren't the dominant history don't find their way into the catalogue records. which means that makes things a lot people that you're looking for a lot harder to find because they're not catalogued in a particular way. Now, something like this is fairly easy to find. It's a bit of propaganda, really, isn't it, for P&O? And I think many of you who've been researching who know about P&O will know that it was a massive employer of Asian labour, and it's portraying sort of a very kind of a smiling, patriotic workforce. But one of the things that obviously I think many of you already know and we found out is a lot of those particular men were paid much lower wages and treated very differently to the white sailors. Sometimes the Asian sailors, the complement, a ship's complement was perhaps made of more Asian sailors than white sailors, but the white history dominates in some of these archives. So this is just something that was quite easy to find, really, because it's a piece of
marketing material, really. Yeah, so you can find this in the library,
so
other libraries. This is like a baseline. Yeah.
You didn't have to search hard.
That's a 20-minute search to find that. And then we go for really, really broad spectrum. The National Maritime Museum, so it has a museum, an observatory, we have a library, we have an archive of manuscripts, and we also have a photograph archive that's massive. They're uncatalogued for the most part. You can't just turn up on Google and look for it, whereas with the books you can. So what we found in the colour transparencies, i.e. slides, here we have a nurse. We think maybe of Malaysian Chinese kind of origin, and this is like the wide spectrum of the type of thing you might come up with, but there's not any temporal coherence to what we're going to see. So this is another type of Asian labour that you might be working on ships. Again, this may seem a bit bizarre, but it also is for people that were employed by companies like P&O or British Steam Navigation Company. They weren't just South Asian, they were also East African. Some of them were emancipated slaves from East Africa at the end of the 19th century, and this particular group of women were involved in coaling, i.e. kind of bringing coal to ships, and they were Zanzibari. They were freed African slaves at Zanzibar who coaled a ship called the Agamemnon. So there is a really broad spectrum of what we think a Lascar sailor is. Also can encompass a lot of different other types of labour from other parts of the world than South Asia. And I'm really sorry the photo.
Oh, hang on, let me just... this is finishing. So we've talked about South Asian sailors, and we've had a look at some of the East African sailors, the East African people, the women who were kind of servicing that kind of Indian Ocean maritime circle. Another thing that sort of loosely falls under the Lascar category are the Chinese sailors, because of course they made a massive contribution to the British maritime world as well. And this particular letter we found is about a Chinese mutiny, isn't it? They refused duty, and it's the official correspondence relating to how they dealt with some Chinese sailors that refused to work. So we found things like that as well.
So I don't know if you can see it. So basically, it's Chinese sailors signing on in Cardiff, in Wales, that refused to sign under Asian articles, which is the discriminatory contract that separated white European labour from other types of labour in merchant shipping. So people who signed under Asian articles worked more for less money, and these Chinese labourers refused to sign on to European articles instead of the already existing Chinese one, dictated their hours of work and conditions. I have a feeling that these guys were kicked off at Suez or something like that, the next stop. But here it is, it's in the merchant shipping, so it's a shipping company archive. You go through some of the official correspondence, you find that people aren't complying with the type of labour conditions that they're expected to. This comes from a type of archive of boat builders. So we have lots and lots of boat builders, shipyards, types of photographs. It turns out in one of the shipyard albums, they took photographs of the crew. So this is British India Steam Navigation Company, so very, very big and like local Indian Ocean routes. They are commissioning a new ship on the Clyde, a great centre of boat building. And in the middle of the pictures of radiators and diesel engines and pipes and decks are the assembled crew, and just very out of blue, so it's quite interesting because you can see the different types of crew. There are crew who are dressed in the exoticizing uniforms of British Industry Navigation Company, other ones who are dressed in kind of black tie, and another from that set shows that obviously some of them appear to be Chinese as well. So there's no obvious racial distinctions among labour categories. And what we can see if one wanted to go further and do more research into this type of image, you can see from the headbands which ships they had worked on previously. So I think this guy was on the Ethiopia, which was another British India steam navigation ship. So one could then go and trace where they had come from to then go on the Clyde to have their pictures taken, and then where that ship went in the Indian Ocean, etc., etc., etc. And that's another picture from the same group. Another type of archive. This, in the National Maritime Museum, we also have ship's plans. These are quite fantastic things physically because they're about 3 meters long, some of them. So and you roll them out, and you have to put weights on, otherwise they roll back up again. And what we found is that they can give you very good ideas about racial segregation on board ships, both for passengers and for crew. What we have here, we have native washhouse male, native washhouse female. That would also be segregation for the passengers as well as for the crew. And I think I have another. This one we have the accommodation for the different labour roles that South Asian sailors had. So we have the accommodation for the topazes, the carpenters, the sarang and tyndals, servants. So they were, let's say, the officers of, they were the people that gave the orders for in the South Asian labour group, and so they would have 2 or 4 better people in their accommodation rather than 40, which are the lowest ones.
And I'm just to mention as well that I'm not an expert interpreting ship plans. We have 2 people who are at the museum, but obviously ships are sort of layered, and the worst accommodation is often saved for the lowest ranking people serving aboard ships. You'll often find that any accommodation set aside for Lascar sailors will be in the sort of the bowels of the ship, very airless, not particularly nice. So these are quite a good social history record of how those men and sometimes women, how they lived.
Depending on the size of the ship, we've seen other ships' plans where if the ship's bigger and slightly more prestigious. So P&O had a flagship with the Viceroy of India, which was launched about 1929. That had separate accommodation for ayahs, so female shy carers. It had separate stairs for European stewards and non-European stewards to go up and down between their accommodation and the dining room areas, which I was quite surprised at that level of segregation. And as you can probably guess, here we have the firemen, the oilmen, the lampmen, and I am wondering whether there is also a racial segregation between people up here and people. I mean, this is like different size of the ship, but there is other things going on in this picture.
So this is the space set aside for religious worship, isn't it?
Yep.
So we don't have a lot of this image, but we've got this kind of image. But we do have, so we've got prayers on
deck. This is Ramadan prayers, I think.
Yeah, Ramadan prayers on deck. And then we've got, I'm not sure which, is this?
Goanese altar, it says in the album.
All right, okay. So this is for the Portuguese Goanese sailors. So I haven't really got much else to say about that. We do have some of those images, but not lots of them.
We have, because for companies like P&O, so this is here, so P&O Dining Saloon Steward, I think 1950. For the men, so if we can imagine on a ship, you have the people that are stoking, that are tending the engine, that are doing manual labour that's both physical and dirty. That would be one group of people, and then you have other groups of people that are doing the service, serving the officers, the stewards. And so the publicity material, P&O like to make a big thing of the fact that it employs South Asians, and so you get, this is a publicity shot for P&O in the 1950s that would have been used as promotional material. This is, I think, some merchant seaman who just, gave his slides to the museum, and you happen to have a group of people being served by stewards. So it's just to show that, depending on labour categories, we may or may not have more. This is on a troop ship in the Second World War, so more of a military ship. And this is, do you want to talk about this one?
we particularly like these records. These are called the colonial cook certificates. I can't remember the date span. They definitely go through
1930s through 1950s probably.
So we don't have many what you call classic family history records for Asian sailors, but we have these, and these are fantastic if you are interested in family history research, and you know that there was a man in your family that worked on British ships as a colonial cook, because this is their applications to be taken
to the Board of Trade,
to the Board of Trade to be registered as a cook, and so you find some personal information about that family member. But you also get some really lovely studio photographs as well. Often, so some of the photographs that myself and Heloise have shown you, you don't actually know who the people are. There's no name. They're kind of like, it might be classified in other people's scrapbooks as Asian crew. You don't always find out any more about them, but this is particularly nice because you find out who the individual is, you have the kind of information you need to do further family history research, and you have a photograph as
well.
You have
the names are on the other side, we haven't shown the names, have them.
How many boxes? We've got quite a few boxes of these.
We've got one box full.
Yeah, and then we've got some...
we
have several boxes of these. So these are a particularly rich resource for anyone who know people living here now who know that that's how their ancestor came over. It's just really lovely to go through.
So this particular person was 1922, no?
That person was born in 1922. Yeah. We've got people that are born in our records that are born in 1939, 1940. So maybe some of those people are still alive, and it ranges.
And so you've got some, just to point out the kind of family history details that we searched. I'm sorry. If you go back to the one, so the year of his birth, we know that his place of birth was Goa, so there's possibly some Portuguese links there. We know his height, eyes and hair, and then there is, so we've got tattoos or other distinguishing marks, so you can find out some quite personal things about your ancestors.
Burn marks, because they're cooks.
Burn marks. But one of the things that you get with the European sailors as well in the family history records, you find out about all their tattoos because they're actually listed, so you get some very personal, as I say, very personal information, which some people like.
Just to show a few, we don't have a lot of material culture. We do have a couple of bits of uniform. So this is a dining room steward from P&O. We have the hat and the belt. So that's another area that we're interested in finding out more. We have a few things that people would have sold as souvenirs on board cruise ships to passengers. But so material culture, less of. But medical information, lots of. Tracey.
So this is one of my favourite collections at the National Maritime Museum, and they're the Dreadnought Seamen's Hospital admission registers. And they're not just about Asian sailors, it's any sailor, any merchant sailor that's had to go to the Dreadnought Seamen's Hospital for whatever reason, because there was a kind of charity set up to help people because of all the kind of illnesses that they would come back with. And every now and again, you have lots of, so you've got like James Crotty down here and Daniel King, but you do find Asian sailors and African sailors in the records. Unfortunately, this is a very early one. This is from the 1830s. So whoever was recording those men that got to the Dreadnought Seamen's Hospital decided that actually their surnames weren't particularly important, but they do have just one name given. So we've got Abraham, Rumjan and Shokasan. And we know the record doesn't, it's a really, really big record, but these columns tell you that they embarked at Bombay and that they were born in Bombay as well. But the other thing that if you're interested in Lascars on ships, because there aren't that many records, this is particularly good because it will tell you the name of the ship that they were on. So often you have maybe records about Lascars in workhouses, say, so you know about the sort of the poverty end and the fact that they're in the country in hard times, but you don't necessarily know about their history aboard ship. So you can actually find the name of their last ship and then go and find, if their records still exist, you can find the records for that ship and see if there's any mention of them or anything about the Lascar cruise. So these are particularly rich in the kind of...
What's the date span?
So the Dreadnought Seamen's Hospital opened in about 1822, but our records go from 1827. Now, because they contain medical information, we have to close the later ones. And one of the reasons is about, I would say, probably a quarter of the men in the registers have got syphilis or some form of venereal disease, and that's one of the reasons why they have to stay closed for, I think, until that person's reached 100 years old. So basically, the records are open to about the 1920s at the moment. So you get nearly 100 years of medical records. This one's particularly, as I said, they've not got the full name, but the later records, they do actually start recording people in much more detail.
I'll come up with I won't go through all of these in excruciating detail, but some of the work that we've been doing has literally been spot the person who isn't white. Somebody has done some of our archives a list of non-European sailors, and so I had to go through, and it happens to be that there will be an African person somewhere in the shot or in the foreground, and sometimes that's all you're going to get, and then you have to try and build from there if you can find out what the ship was and all of that type of thing, where it was sailing. This is
Dreadnought again. This is a later Dreadnought record. I'm sorry, this one's really unclear. This is from the turn of the 20th century, and this, I think it's open on a page where we particularly have a lot of Chinese sailors, but this is better now because it records much more information about the men. I don't know if we can see illnesses on here. Let's see if I can... there you go. There's a guy there who's got syphilis, so that just to prove that it does have quite a lot of grim detail in those admission registers.
Moving on to the first one. We do have some of the things in our archives are people's met scrapbooks and memories. So here we have groups of Somali sailors that were recruited in the First World War in the Red Sea and came on board. So that's another area that you may not have thought was associated with Lascar history, but we thought it kind of encompassed the broad span.
And
here are crew lists from the Second World War.
This is a really interesting record. So Heloise mentioned at the beginning the Asian articles. Now, what's happened in terms of what's been saved in the archives, the European crew lists are stored either here at the, not here, I often do this talk at the National Maritime Museum, I'm not there now, at the National Maritime Museum, the National Archives, or the Memorial University in Canada, Newfoundland, Canada. What has happened is there was a load of records made to record Asian sailors, but they were kept on a separate agreement, and those, we believe, have been destroyed, thrown away, they've gone missing. So it's quite easy to find European sailors. It's not that easy to find named Asian sailors. So sometimes you have to go around it in a strange way, like looking at the Dreadnought Seamen's Hospital registers and finding out the ships that way. This is really good because this shipping company, we've got this massive book of crews. And what happens is, for most it goes from about the 1930s, and whenever they have Asian crew, they just say, 50 Indians or 50 Asians. They don't actually name the people. And then what happened, in 1941, one of their ships was sank, and my interpretation is that they couldn't work out who they'd lost. And after they'd lost that ship, from 1941 onwards, they start recording the name, the full name, the village and the name of the father of the man who served, and you've got about 40 or 50 pages of those sailors, and you just think, oh, fantastic! Someone's actually bothering to record people's names. But the really sad thing is, once the war ends, they stop recording the Asian sailors' names, as though you don't lose ships in peacetime, do you? You don't need to know who might have been on those ships if they go down for some kind of accident. So this is a really fantastic way of finding out more about individuals.
A lot of these names, like some the Bengali names, Bangladeshi names.
Sorry, so
some of the names there sounds like Abdul Latif and all those. Sounds like Bangladeshi names.
Bangladeshi names.
Oh yeah,
well,
I think
if we go to
are.
especially if we can find it on the other margin of where they've come from and where their fathers have come from.
Yeah, we couldn't. Some of the records, when you open them out, we just couldn't photograph them. We just didn't have the type of camera we needed to do it.
This is just a snapshot of.
Let me just.
This is people who have come from a British ship.
So it's indentures. So this will be about apprenticeship indentures.
And as you probably know, people that were on British ships were not supposed to stay in Britain. And you can see on the bottom left an agreement that they will not hold the company liable while they're in Britain, and they will go back to whichever place they came from. So, and this is a shot of Asian sailors in Tilbury docks. So. That's another part of what we have. We also have in our historic ship collection photographs a lot of photographs of people doing work. A lot of the time we do not have their names. For some of the East African, we have a series where we have East Africans in the 1960s, we have their names, they've been written on the backs, but it really does depend. So a lot of visual archive, but not necessarily good for family history. Again, we have colour transparencies of slides with these publicity shots, I think. And what's interesting is that then you can link up a publicity shot of people cleaning the sides of a P&O ship with archives showing industrial accidents. So here, a particular person has bumped his head or has been sent off to hospital, and they will then name the Asian crew member who has been sent off. So that's one way that you can try and map up the visual with the. Here is another person who has.
It's an accident.
Who is recorded as British, so has obviously been in Wales for a while, and then has had some nasty accident and has been sent off the ship. These again are more troop ship photos, so I might just move on from here because we're now 26 minutes in. Do you want to talk about the...
Right, so this is scrapbooks, isn't it? So we have a large collection of scrapbooks, and most of them, I have to say, are the scrapbooks of Europeans. But we looked at the as many scrapbooks as we can find as Europeans who served in Asian bases and Asian in the Indian Ocean, because often they will take photographs and include them in their scrapbook, but obviously a lot of the interpretation is going to be from a European point of view. So here the interpretation is celestial domestics, which we find all kinds of terminology that possibly people that will find offensive. I mean, we found some of the material relating to Chinese and Japanese sailors contributing to the First World War effort. And again, the way that those people are described is in quite sort of what we consider very racist terms now. So that we find the source, but it's a very European.
But what's happening here is that these people are on the China station. So that's what work now is about, Taiwan or those places. Chinese people would go on ships and be domestic servants / laundrymen for the naval guys. So we have mementos and letters and young boys who've been taken adopted. And then as at a later date we do have pictures of Chinese people. I think this guy was a carpenter who's made a wooden ship in his spare time. Two last pictures here. One thing that I found very troubling, anyone who's studied colonial photography in the Victorian era, is a set of slides. If you have studied or looked at or read about colonial photography in the Victorian era, there's a lot of taking pictures of people and then designating their racial category by their profile, by their nose, or by their posture or cranium, or all of those type of things. And what I found is a series of slides of, it seems that somebody's doing exactly the same thing for shots in the 1950s. I don't see why you would be doing this type of profiling if there wasn't some kind of racial imagery. Some of my colleagues tell me I'm reading too much into the images, but I thought it was curious, and so I put them on display. We don't know yet why this guy took these pictures and why they need to take a strap with the steer from the back. It's all
so you said 50s, 1950s?
Yeah, I'd say the 1950s, yeah. It's colour transparency, so that would be about the straight line, yeah. A mystery to be solved way in the future. And just who knows what's going on in this picture? I think it's another publicity shot for the Stripliner merchant line. So to wrap up, I think we're at this stage. We found loads of stuff. We're not quite sure if we know everything enough about it, and we would really like to exchange with you to learn about if you've found anything interesting or if you've observed anything in what we said today. We might be able to answer some of your questions, and other people might be able to answer them. And I'd like to hear from you, so put on the lights and let's have a chat.
Questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it was fascinating to see the contribution of all these Lascars from different parts of the world. But I was a bit sort of taken back by the lack of research done on the Bangladeshi Lascars. I don't know if it's put under the broad term of Asians, but whereas Somali and Lascars are categorically differentiated, as well as East Africa and other. But you haven't categorically looked into the Bangladeshi Lascars. Is there a reason why?
Because the way that because the records that we're looking at have been written by white Europeans, so for example the Dreadnought Seamen's Hospital registers, so some of the designations, one of the later people who are Somali or Chinese or South Asian or even Southeast Asian in those records are all classified in the same way. So we're looking at records from they're British records, and we've not basically found them, but we've not kind of started parting.
In the archive, under the British categories, everybody who's not British is usually called native.
Yeah.
So we're starting from a position of utter ignorance of how even to find any type of history in these archives. Because what we're looking at is we've started from there's no way in the catalogue you can find it, nobody in the museum knows about it, so we've just tried to find who is working in the British maritime world.
I'm from Bangladeshi, and I've heard a lot of stories, all the stories of Lascars, my granddad and other people. But it seems to be here that in the presentation there's been a very lack of a kind of narrative.
So there's two reasons. So one of them is that in the museum, nobody yet has actually at the museum, none of the employees is an expert in Bengali history or any kind of non-European history pretty much, except me who knows about Mauritian history, which isn't really the same thing. That's one reason. And number two, the way that the archives are classified is that you can't type something into the catalogue and expect to find, you can find an admiral in a wig, you can probably find an officer in a cap, and then for anything else, you just have to sit and rifle through a box and see what you come up. So we're at that stage, we're at like stage one of research. And now it happens that I've done a bit of African history, so had a bit of an interest in East Africa. It's something I do know about. I don't know anything about South Asian history, except from what I found in here. So I'm starting from complete ignorance, and that's why we're reaching out to you to see if we can get, but you may have people in your family that you know about the stories. I don't mind, so that's why.
Can I just say, because a bit later on we're going to talk about the project that we want to do, and that is inviting people to help us to interpret, because we're coming from the point of view that we found records, but we're not, as we say, we're not experts. So you're talking about in your family hearing stories from your grandfather. One of the things we're interested in is the kind of family and community histories to help us interpret, because we're not experts, we've just found stuff. So in some very strange ways as well, by, not at one point you couldn't type in Lascar or into our catalogue and find anything. You can find some records now because we've been tagging them, but to actually do that kind of research where we're just looking for Bangladesh, we just couldn't, because it's just not been classified that way. We just had to find whatever we could and then just kind of put it out there and say we need some help basically interpreting and cataloguing this. We want people with community history knowledge to be able to do this. We can't do it on our own.
There's an interesting sort of, just because the question is so relevant, there's some research done on Vivek Bald, I think, a scholar in the US, who basically traced back reverse. So Bengali sailors who sort of went off the ship from Ellis Island and then married Puerto Rican women, and they have entire family branches, and you can basically trace that back to oral history and 1920s and 30s and forward.
Wonderful.
And there's a whole sort of,
but it's matching up the people that want to do it with the people that have access to some paper archives. Some people have access to oral history, and trying to get people together to.
I would say that when we do have places of origin named, we think we have slightly more people of Bangladesh. We think more Bangladeshi people than Chinese people than
East African is very small minority.
Yeah. So we do believe that a lot of the people that we found, particularly say in the Dreadnought Seamen's Hospital records, are of Bangladeshi origin. But again, we want to consult people from the Bangladeshi community to help us to understand that is the case.
I think it's Mr. Chair, wasn't it? Maybe she can hear you.
Do you feel, Tim?
Otherwise it can be answered.
Okay, so we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yes. So thank you very much for the work that you're doing. and then many of us here, and this work is very close to our hearts. So thank you. I've got a couple of questions. There was this lovely novel called I think Sea of Poppies, from Calcutta to Mauritius, that route, and that was during the sailing ship's time. So my first question would be: is there anything? Do you go as far back as that? Are there any records of the sailing ship days?
The Red Knot Seamen's Hospital registers, the early ones, because they start around the late 1820s, definitely sailing ship days. But we haven't found 18th century. We haven't found a lot of 18th century. We've got early 19th, but I've got early 19th century. So the days of sail are still.
We do have them, and there are scholars that have worked on them. We've got a guy coming to do, who's got some money from the museum, who's done a lot of things about 18th century mutinies by Asian sailors on ships. That's not. I mean, not only am I not an expert in this history, I'm a historian of the 19th and 20th century. So, because of my own expertise, I'm not very good at reading wiggly writing. We kind of stopped at the 1850s, but there are some scholars who have done more about that in our own archives. So I would be able to put you in touch with people if you're interested in that. And there's a guy, one of the guys is coming to talk in London in January about that very subject. So there are other people that we can reach out to about that subject.
Because I think Visram in her book mentions, or she in her lectures, about in the late 18th century, about Lascars having religious events in East London.
Mm-hmm.
So I was just wondering as well whether have you got any information on settlements?
We're primarily at Maritime archives, so if it's on land, it would probably be a dockyard rather than people living on land. And things like people, the sort of demographic records that you might want. So records of the parish, we as a rule we don't have them. The only kind of births and deaths and marriages that we record are the ones that happen on ships. So you probably want to go and see somewhere like London Metropolitan Archives for that kind of thing, or possibly, I don't know what Tower Hamlets Archive are like for keeping old parish records, but that might be another place to look for early settlement. Yeah.
We have people in the room that worked a lot with that stuff. So.
Just finally, on the Dreadnought Seamen's Hospital, is there any record of the first Asian doctors serving there?
You know, we don't. This is what we have. We have patients' admission registers. We also have some information, which is not very good, about nurse training. But I think because the Dreadnought Seamen's Hospital had really close links at one point with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, I think if you're interested in doctors, they might be a better place, because I think they might have those kind of records we don't. We're very much focused on the patient records here.
I think, guys, King's Policy still has a merchant seamen's unit.
Yeah, they do.
And I think that is a continuation of the Singhani board that was built with money from a shipping magnate, Asian shipping magnate. And I think there might be some kind of crossover there as well.
But for doctors' records, like LSHTM, they might be a good port of call, because they were very closely linked at one point to the Dreadnought.
Before we move on to the next question, I just wondered if Nazneen would like to introduce herself to everybody who doesn't already know her and the work that she's doing.
I think some of the people who might have come before to different lane circles other years. I've presented before, but my name's Nazneen Ahmed, and I've done research on Lascar seafarers, particularly in terms of their religious practices. I presented last year with Shahida Rahman, who's written a novel called Lascar. I don't know if you've been in touch with her, because that's I think one way of recuperating stories is through fiction and drama. So that probably would have been my contribution to this, to think about ways in which we can kind of recover voices, and also to draw your attention to the two sets of oral histories that we do have, which is Caroline Adams' set of history and Yusuf Islam's, Yusuf Chaudhry's Birmingham set of oral histories, which might be a way to supplement some of the stuff that you have. But yes.
Thank you. So,
I'm interested in the sort of political lives of sailors internationally in different ports and on ship as well. So I was wondering if the museum has documents like ship's logbooks or other material like that which would record instances of insubordination or desertion?
There are certainly people that have looked at that question using our archives, and I can put you in touch with people who've done that. So the guy I was talking about, Aaron Jaffa, who's done in the 18th century, he has used that. And there's another guy who works at Colgate University in the States called John Hislop, who has also looked at dock workers' insubordination, both on ship and in port cities in South Africa. So using the National Maritime Museum archives. So there are, at our stage, we have just tried to do a broad overview, but there definitely are researchers that have already been to the National Maritime Museum to look very, very specifically at those type of issues. When the closest, because a lot of the archives are top down, I mean, what I mean is, in the merchant seamen's archives, you'll get the directors writing to each other about cargoes. And so sometimes the life of what happens on the ship is definitely harder to find. And in our overview, we didn't find it, but there are other researchers who have.
Just to mention some of a lot of the things that we found were what we call, we found them within Section 3 records, which are business records. So we found very little of personal documentation in their business records, and the other thing about business records before they come to the archive, often they're weeded by the businesses before they deposit them, so sometimes things they've just ended up in a skip and they're just.
We do have logbooks as well, and so people have managed to use that for those type of questions.
There's quite a lot of material about the 1946 mutinies on the Royal Indian Navy. A lot of the sort of, I just found them today. There's lots of kind of the lieutenant's personal papers where they're preparing their submissions to the commission, and it's quite interesting to see the way that they get changed before they submit something. That would be one thing to really look at.
Do you have a follow-up? Is that your question?
I also wanted to ask if you found anything that was produced by Lascars themselves in terms of censored letters or diaries.
Written materials was by any.
One of the.
We haven't yet found, but that's not to say they're not there. Just so you know, in the time we allotted to the task, we haven't found it yet.
I was going to say one of the ambitions when we started looking to see what we could.
Was the secret cache of Lascar diaries. We were all.
One of our ambitions was to create something called an archive journey box, and we use these quite a lot in the museum to teach different groups. But for them to work, they have to have something very personal in their letters and diaries, because it helps the kind of learners we learn them with are the sort of non-academic learners, so you know, people at a different level of learning, but you need the personal story to get those people in, and that was one of the ambitions, and we've scrapped our ambition for an archive journey box because we just haven't found the letters and the diaries.
If you have ancestors or people that have written diaries and you'd like to share this with the museum, we would definitely be interested in learning about them. And it could be that there's a box in one of our warehouses hasn't been opened yet. It's like Indiana Jones.
But we did spend a long time. I mean, there's definitely more stuff there.
I'm sure there's more stuff.
We did spend a lot of time looking, and we just couldn't find everything.
We never looked at that at the Royal Indian Navy, so there's still loads to look at.
Yeah, we had to stop at one point because I think people were thinking we were just some kind of like strange obsessives that just like lived in an archive and we had other jobs to do in the museum. But there's definitely more stuff there. I hope there's some personal stuff.
I think this evening discussion should encourage us to visit the museum and use these resources for research and for our own academic interests and other pursuits. I think that would be
yes. I think we'll talk about that. Yeah, definitely. If anyone's got more questions, they'll talk more about that.
I think you had a question.
I don't know whether you or other people here know. Just in terms of the ships, what they were actually trading, and were they all East India Company ships, or were they kind of like private traders and so on and so on? And the Lascars, was that the Lascars who came to work on the ships, was there a sort of an infrastructure in the places where they came from that supplied the labour? I don't know whether you.
There's two questions. One of them. Do you have your book that you?
So
the question of infrastructure and supplying labour has been answered by the guy that wrote this book. Well, answered. He's had a good stab. So if you want to know about how Indian labour was recruited in different ports at different times and from what type of areas and that side of things, this guy's written a really great book. I would recommend that you look at. In terms of cargo, well, one of the things that, given that I've studied Mauritian history and Indian Ocean, indentured labour, that type of thing, is that some of the companies that we've showed you their archives, they were transporting indentured labour around the Indian Ocean, say to Mauritius, Natal, Reunion, and then obviously to Fiji and to the Caribbean. They were transporting indentured labour, Indian indentured labourers, or South Asian indentured labourers, and also had Lascars on board. So we did find one archive that we haven't shown you the picture, where the Lascars complain that their food isn't as good as the indentured labourers, for example. So there's those type of things. Massive companies like British India Steam Navigation, if P&O does Britain to India, basically, British India Steam Navigation does all the little ports in between around the Indian Ocean. And in my area of research, British India Steam, they're transporting people, they're transporting mixed cargo. In my area that I know about, they're also transporting African indentured labourers around the east of the Indian Ocean to Reunion, which is another island in Mauritius. So they're transporting a lot of people, a lot of goods, but also our people as well.
Yeah. So the Lascars were employees; they were sort of freely employed. They
would have signed the Asian articles that we talked about, the ones that don't exist anymore, which makes it really. Well, apparently they don't exist. Maybe we'll get a surprise, and that's one of the good things about talking at events like this. Someone will say, well, actually, you might be wrong. But they signed Asian articles, which was a contract that gave them harsher working conditions and less wages.
And it's supposed to geographically contain them to certain areas. They, for example, in the Pacific, there weren't supposed to be South Asian sailors sailing to Fiji, to San Francisco, all of those type of places. Those settler societies wanted to keep the sailors on board the ships coming white. So they did from a certain period, I think from the 20th century, but correct me if I'm wrong, Siamese Asiatic articles or Asian articles, but in the 19th, I'm not sure for the 18th and 19th century what type of agreements they signed.
We don't always have agreements. The ones that we have date from the end of the 19th century. So this is to do with how the bureaucracy developing around contracts. Before that, it's harder because it could have been done in a more ad hoc way rather than a formalised crew agreement that's been negotiated by national law. So that might be where some of the gems are found. So company archives that have been submitted.
And just last one, do you know when it ended, the kind of Lascar sort of use, as it were?
The use of the word or the use of alien articles?
Well, is it simply? Is Lascar simply a person employed on a ship from
As I understand, from somebody, you may want to.
It's still in use, I think.
Yeah,
it's still in use. The term and that's. But obviously, Asian articles, that's obviously.
As I understand from the 18th, I have a colleague who's working on the 17th and 18th century, and as I understand, it's a term for somebody that works on a ship, but it doesn't mean South Asian necessarily. Even in the 18th century, it could mean another. This is Jessie Ransley, who works at the University of Southampton, who's working on that. That's what she's told me.
Anybody who works on a ship?
Excuse me?
Anybody who works on a ship?
Anybody who isn't British or European that works on a ship, yes. So it could be African, it could be Chinese, it could be...
Southeast Asian.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware. And I know...
Now?
That's a question I'll bring out to the floor.
I found something interesting when I was looking at the article.
Do you want to come in?
To answer your question, the term Lascar is from a Persian origin, which means warrior. So, and again, going back to the data, when I was doing my essay, which you remember, I think the oral history is much more realistic and much more countable than the data which is there on the record, because it's a very European version of Lascar. And when you say Bombay or Calcutta, that is not the place of origin, because British India had Madras presidency, Calcutta and Bombay. These were the three presidencies, and Bombay, Calcutta and Madras were the ports of...
Well, that's what this guy in that book explains, is the much more...
Most of the Lascars from Bangladesh came from a village called Sylhet. So, and...
Not a village.
District. So, and then there was a hierarchy, and like how the modern day recruiters, they were Indian recruiters called Serang, who recruited the Lascars or anyone who are willing to go on board, and then they worked for the Serangs, not for the company. So part of their salary goes to a native person in India.
So there's a particular structure of employment that determines what a Lascar is, I suppose.
And in some of the, I was going to say, in some of the P&O material from the 1970s, there's a manual that says we mustn't say Lascars anymore. That's considered a. So it's a term. It's a term that comes and goes into whether people want to use it or not. As far as I can see, in the 60s, it seemed to be a bit taboo word within the company.
I think that in that book that you've got in front of you at the moment, you'll find a really excellent discussion on the term, both in its official use, sort of stemming from the 1823 Merchant Shipping Acts, right the way through to an assertion by the people who were classified as Lascars as not being Lascars but being equal seafarers to everybody else. But it's a really sort of like complex and contested term, and I think it stopped being used within the Indian Navy well before it was used by the P&O, etc., who sort of continued to use the term, which I mean, Balachandran uses it as to describe seagoing coolies. So in the same way that the word coolie became very pejorative, then the word Lashkar was in the same way. Sorry. So you had a question.
Yeah, so I don't know what you're thinking in terms of the tone of your eventual exhibit, whether it's meant to be a kind of celebratory, there were lots of non-white, non-British people who contributed to, the maritime history that your institution, or whatever the kind of sort of angle will be. But one thing that to me is really interesting, and this builds on your question a bit, is rather than just kind of separating out the Lascars, but to sort of take the question of, and we'll just stick with Bengali bodies on these ships, and they came in the form of Lascars, but they also, as you pointed out, were in the form of cargo. And while doing something totally different using the gazetteers from the 1800s and late 1700s, and I wasn't looking at maritime history at all, I was looking at Chittagong records, and those, talk of the port came up, so tangentially I sort of scanned things relating to ships and the level of documentation about cargo. And for the Bengal gazetteers, it was mostly people from Sylhet and also from Assam, present-day Bangladesh, at that time. And there's such a high level of documentation regarding cargo, and not necessarily in the kind of like cruel or dehumanizing. I mean, there's like an attention to the health and well-being, and so there's a question then of labor and of bodies and of the Bengali kind of labor that was going to be more valued, whether the work on the ship versus the work to be done on a plantation at a specified point in the future. And so, like, really quickly, I mean, I would imagine that if you kind of start from this political economy of the worth of labor and then worth of the body that is presumed to do that kind of labor, that will then filter down into the sort of records that were or were not maintained. And so I guess the question I have is like, maybe you're going to talk about this later on, but like, what is the kind of story that's being told here? And also, have you kind of thought about sort of going to the British Library and starting not from the point of recruitment necessarily, but I mean even just doing a scan of like, because the gazetteers have a whole maritime, or at least for the Bengal, I was only looking at the Bengals, have a section kind of dedicated to port activity and like what the ships were doing as they were heading out in like quite detailed charts. So it might not be at the Maritime Museum because it was more port-based.
So, if I may speak to that, it's a really interesting question. I've worked with Tracey and Heloise at the museum, and your question basically opens up a massive question of museological approach to kind of what's known in the museum world as hidden histories or underrepresented histories, which is that absolutely spot on. Your perspective is kind of pretty much what audiences want, the story, the kind of the angle, the wide spectrum. But museum workers are very limited by starting with objects invariably. So I might be sort of in a conversation like that about an idea for an exhibition like that, and I'd be saying, we need to take a wide angle, or this is not reflective of multicultural audiences at the moment, our needs, or what audiences want from a museum like this. But invariably, you get caught on the issue of what objects do we have, what do we have that we can actually show in an exhibition. So on the one hand, someone like Heloise and Tracey would be sort of a little bit it's incredibly exciting to find the object, but they're also kind of limited, as they're describing to you, in their search by the objects that they have. So yes, absolutely, in time, as an exhibition would evolve, you would do all the extra research and go to the British Library and borrow stuff from there. But because you're kind of institutionally specific in a way that an academic might not be, you kind of have to start from, well, our responsibility is mining these objects which have not been mined previously by previous generations of curators, and our responsibility is to mine this stuff. So we have to start with what we have. So on the one hand, you've got this kind of, as they're describing, it's kind of this tension, which is exactly what I'm not answering your question in a way, I'm just sort of amplifying and sort of giving you the kind of practical museum-bound, hide-bound kind of version of this problematic. But it's kind of, you're talking about two sides of the same kind of problem, essentially, and they're telling you from the end of the telescope, and you're saying, but I want their thing at the other end of the telescope, and we all want that same thing. But in order to get there, you'd have to put together academics, other institutions, this institution, and we're starting from this kind of metonymic, if you want, end of the spectrum. Well, we've got this stuff, we've got this 1 or 2 bits here, we found it, and we want all of that all together. So I'm sure, being good historians, they will probably say, I'm keeping an open mind, I'm not telling you at this point what the story is.
That's
Well,
that's the point of inviting people from
Stories
Bangladeshi
can you see?
community. Yeah, so it's not, we're not telling people what the story is. We're saying we found the objects, so we have to foreground the collection in the exhibition. That's what we do. What we also want is, because as people have pointed out, we found things, but we're not telling a story. We're not giving. That's because it's not been catalogued in a way that gives us any kind of story. And where there is any cataloguing, it's from a very dominant white European point of view. So what we're not saying that we have a story that we want people to follow. We're saying, come and help us to interpret, and then we'll shape something around the way that those contributions go. That's part of my practice, because I've done projects, not in this kind of project before, but I've worked on other projects where you invite people in and you get them to help you to shape it. But I'm not coming from the point that I know where to find this stuff. I know how to do good archive research. I don't necessarily know how to interpret to make it relevant to people who really want to see that stuff displayed.
Are there any other questions?
Yes. I was interested to know, in all the treasure trove you have you found records of how they were recruited, what were the terms? I know you talked Asian articles, but what were the terms of payment? How was it received? There must be records. The British were very good at keeping.
Well, going for Maritime, who did his book, where he did a lot of research, pretty much none of our stuff came into his chapters about that particular subject. So what the stuff we have at the Maritime Museum isn't, as far as we know, the floor is open to anyone else who wants to go and dig in our archives, isn't really great at the nitty-gritty of people's history. Apart from the images are really good because that's like people have taken shots of people doing stuff. So that's where we have like the average sailor doing manual labour. Whereas how he's paid, what his conditions of recruitment were, who they were dealing with in whichever port to get him on that ship. That's not what we're really good at. So that guy that wrote that book, he went a lot into archives in India to look at that particular subject. We have a lot of visual representations, photographs, ships, plans, where we can kind of get that history from another angle. But that nitty-gritty money side of things, as far as I can see, we don't have. What we have a lot of, because of the way our archive was donated by people who had ships and shipping companies, is like managers writing to each other about the price of cotton.
I found one book that had estimated Lascar wages for each voyage and each port, that they had kind of recruited a set of Lascars and compared to the white wages. And so I think that's just one. It's so arbitrary like that because it just depends on which shipping company wants to record what information.
Who's going to give their archive to the Maritime Museum afterwards?
It's not like one set of logbooks will record that, but another set of logbooks won't record that, and that will just be lost, missing information. So, but that was kind of interesting because you can get an idea that, you know, obviously Kolkata was a place that the majority of Lascars were recruited from. You get like £200 worth of Lascars or shillings, or I don't know. But you know, worth of Lascar wages being paid at that port, and then also at Cardiff. So you know, there are different sets of. So that was interesting to me. But then I would then go back to Balatandra and look at that. And I think it's the case that there were agents who were recruiting, and they had the records in Karachi, in Kolkata, in Bombay, and what's happened to those agent recruiters' records, I'm not sure yet. So it's kind of putting those together. Because there's stuff at the Indian Office records, there's stuff at National Maritime, but it's kind of triangulating all of that.
We've got only one triangle that we're trying to do something with, and it's not like we can't go and look at that stuff, but our actual job that we're paid for. So that's the thing. No, so it's really hard. So we like to know that what we have is kind of vague, but we do have some stuff, but then we need people to also help us triangulate with what they've got elsewhere and help us see what we can, you know, whether we do have those stories that we've just missed them.
Well, I guess our advantage is that we're not stuck to an institution like you, so you know you are one of the resources that we can use. You have a question?
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was very insightful. I just want to ask, are you seeking to categorise these objects in order to help other institutes or external people to develop narratives around these objects? And if so, what approaches do you have in categorising these objects?
Okay, so one of the things that we're looking to do, so one of the things we talked about was how a lot of the records we found were Section 3 records. They're business records for particular companies. They're still business records for those companies, but what I've talked to the manuscripts team about at the museum is to enhance existing records so it makes it clear, more detail about that kind of Lascar content. One of the things that we've done as a sort of an interim thing, which isn't ideal, is we've tagged the things that we found, because what used to happen is if you typed in Lascar as a search term into the archive catalogue, you just came up with very, very little. Now we've tagged things, so things come up on the search, but it doesn't tell you anything more about what that is. So you then have to go and search through the records like we did, but at least you know that there is something in there. So the next thing is, and this will take longer because it has to be done in a particular way, is then to enhance the existing catalogue records, that when people click and find, when they get their drop down that says this is a record, they can read exactly what the Lascar content is, not just that they have to then rummage through the whole, what could be a huge volume, and then find it wasn't useful for their research. So it is going in stages. That's the thing. We've tagged, but we haven't enhanced the catalogue records, but we will do.
So the general point being is that it's our job to use the collections to tell stories. Yeah. It's the nation's heritage, so we need to make it easily available for people to use. And to anybody that wants to come and consult it, that's the taxpayers' right to come and do so. So we're trying to help people to do so, not being specific experts, but also to hopefully tell stories about the things as well as just for researchers.
And maybe it's just worth adding that the sort of question of how archives are catalogued and how information becomes available, it's really about politics and power. And historically, when you look at museums, the people's stories that are told are generally those people in power, and the records that are most detailed are either because those people had power at the time, or people invested a huge amount of time afterwards. So just to give you a really crude example, at somewhere like the Maritime Museum, Nelson is incredibly important. There are thousands and thousands of people who are obsessed with Nelson, and they, for example, might put together like years of volunteer time looking at Nelson records and putting loads of detail in there in their own time, retired admirals and these kind of people. For instance, I'm just giving you like ridiculous sort of example. But then, once all of those hours of basically intellectual capital have been poured into those records, obviously they're now much richer and much more available to other people. Now, I've been working on sort of British Asian history on and off for sort of 10, 15 years. I've seen now that a generation is coming of age now, where my parents' generation, first generation, they're dying, and so people like me are spending more time, and yourself, and kind of getting into British Asian research and investing time in that and having, kind of capacity to do it. My hope would be in the next kind of few decades, there would be an equivalent of those Nelson obsessives of people like maybe some of the people in this room, maybe, people who are not yet born, who will spend that time doing that work and making those records richer. And this is, the tip of that.
This is just the
process.
Sure, it's about shifting the gears.
One of the things that me and Heloise were always very clear about when we started doing this, because of the time that we devoted to it, there's no point us finding those records and having a nice project and then everyone in the museum forgets it. But the aim has always been to make sure that they're catalogued better, so that people can use them for that kind of research. And as Sarah said, you can find anything you want about Nelson in our archive because people have invested that time. So this is the start of investing that time to
Should we talk about the project as a whole?
Oh, right, okay. I haven't got a fancy PowerPoint to talk about the project,
which you're probably all relieved about.
So my job as the Archive Learning Officer is to provide better access to the archive, and this is the start of providing better access to the records that we have about Asian sailors. Now, it's come up a few times in the questions that you're not telling us a story, you've not categorised it, it's not defined. So what we want to start doing from next spring is we want to recruit some volunteers to help us with the interpretation of those records. And so we'll be running all kinds of workshops. So we'll be running workshops around how you do archival research, how you can do family history research, and also we're collecting people's stories so that we can help to enhance the records that we already have. So it's a bit of a two-way process. So we'll offer some training around archival research and other things that we can offer, but we're asking you to kind of bring your stories to help us to develop. So we'll be doing that for several months, and we haven't decided on the frequency of when we'll meet yet. It depends on who volunteers and who has what amount of time. But the idea is that we would meet regularly to work on the collections. We're not just enhancing. We're not just talking to ourselves. We want to talk to the wider people who come to the museum. So the ambition is to have a display in a place called the Compass Lounge from autumn 2015 to spring 2016. So it's out there in, we get thousands and thousands of visitors a year. So we do the specific research. We then show it to people in the museum to make them aware of the histories and the work that's gone on. And then the lasting legacy is that there's all the enrichment that goes back into the catalogue so that the work's not forgotten. So that's basically the project in a nutshell. I mean, we could put on a display in the Compass Lounge, we could get some of those photographs and we could write our interpretation, but we're not being, we're pretending then that we're experts in things that we're not necessarily experts in, and that's why we want people who know more about the family history, the community history, Lascar history to come and help us to interpret those things. So that actually what we're providing is a more honest exhibition.
More expert, because it's certainly not me the expert in the subject.
Yeah, so that's what we're looking to do. Now, the dates are a little bit early. We said spring 2015 because actually we've got to spend some time recruiting people we've got to have a good number of people. We realise that not everyone can come all the time, and some people will drop in and out of the project. But what we do want is people to help us to realise our ambitions in this area. And we do definitely want it something to go on display in the autumn. When we have the display on in the museum, we don't just put exhibitions and displays on, we also have event programmes that run alongside them as well. So one of the other ambitions when this is all on display is to have community conference and to invite other people to contribute and to see what we've done and to kind of keep generating interest in the work that we're doing. So what I've done basically is I've got these that I'm going to let you all have at the end. And one of them is just something about the museum, the kind of programmes that we have. And then I've just made this little insert just for tonight. And what we're going to, with mine and Heloise's contact details on here. So just people who are interested, just to email us. We can start collecting names, we can start working how we're going to start, when we're going to start offering things. And also to get some people's feedback from tonight as well, so we can start the ball rolling. The other thing that I wanted to extend to people, as well as the chance to let us know that you're interested, is I deliver all kinds of events in the museum free of charge. And if you're not quite sure about what I do or what the archive is, and you don't really want to send in all your contact details because you don't know what on earth you're getting into, just to say that I've got a couple of pages in the brochures detailing some of the events that I do that are free, that you can come along to, look at some of the archival materials that we have, and just drop in and find out more and sort of feel comfortable with the place. The other thing we can do as well, that myself and Heloise discussed beforehand, is if you contact us and you can't come to any of these kind of events just to kind of find out more about us, if we have enough people contact us, we'll just set up something specially so you can come to the museum, have a browse of the archive, have a chat, maybe some tea and some cake, and just find out more actually on site where you can see those sorry?
Steady.
I've got enough budget for it. I don't want a cake. I do cake. So it's really just to start the ball rolling, because we're not saying we've got this particular story and we want to tell this very specific story that we've designed. We're not saying that. We're saying come and talk to us, come and see what we've got, and then let's see if we can work together and move this forward and make a lasting legacy, really. Eventually we'll move on, won't we, Heloise? I don't think we're going to retire in our posts, but I don't know. But if we move on, then who's going to know about it? And that's
this
what
thing we spent a year doing. So this is like the next phase.
So this is another year doing, but making it more public this time.
We've done all the boring bits. So
sorry,
there's a question.
Yeah.
You made it very clear that it's, I think, the needle in a haystack when you're looking for individuals. In terms of the structure of your collection, is it easier to look if you know what ships you're looking for? Is stuff classified?
Given that it's a maritime museum and Curator, and most of the last 70 years was created by ship fanatics, always much easier to look for a ship, definitely. Yeah. Ship and the year of the ship is, especially for the photographs. The photographs are classified often by ship.
Right.
So
we know a lot more about what ships Lascars might be on, and so
I'm afraid we know a lot more about the number 2 lifeboats on that ship than we know about the Lascars on it. Yeah.
But even so, it would tell us where the pictures might be and where.
Absolutely. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So ships. So that requires some kind of. For that type of approach, it would require some basic understanding of British maritime shipping companies in the 19th, 20th century. But we've got lots of experts in that in the museum that can help with that. But yeah, that's one approach that really works well.
So I was looking at one of the World War II sort of when they started keeping records of the names and stuff. In terms of number-wise, so there was 71 crew, and it's just the math. So there's a 49 or 50 plus of them were classified as either Indian deck workers or Indian saloon workers. So we're talking 70 to 80% of the crew is basically Indian. So is this, or rather, does Indian mean Indian, or could it be Chinese, or what are we talking about?
In this particular case, because of the port they're operating at, I think they are actually, I think they're South Asian.
Sometimes they're classified as native.
I mean, because you've obviously gone through more of the archives, just from a general glance, of the total number of Lascars that were working, or sort of the crew, native crews, what's the percentage, plus minus?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. So it depends on the type of ship, and I'm not a ship expert. So for example, P&O passenger liner, kind of luxury, not as luxury as like American passenger liner across the Atlantic. So you've got fancy saloons, people with teapots, all of that stuff. So you need the saloon staff. And they are all the stereotypes that go in is steward, but that kind of. So you've got lots of those type of waiting on hand and foot type of people, and then you need the stokers to put the coal in the engines, and they are also very likely to be South Asians as well.
How far back do you stretch? Does the figure sort of remain stable?
That's a great question. I don't know if you can answer that. I don't know if Balachandra.
I'm not sure we at the museum we haven't.
I would need to consult with my British maritime history people for that.
But I'm just trying to
great question. I don't know.
For example,
and I think it probably would depend.
How many people? How many sort of, let's say, out of 100 Lascars, where there's sort of 50 were Bengal origin folks? That's what I'm trying to say.
It would depend on the port of call.
And
from Bombay, it was mostly Punjabi Pathans and Konkani and go and crew. And from Calcutta, obviously, it'd be Noakhali, Sylhet, Chittagong.
But that's interesting in the sense that that's shipwise. But if you take sort of step back and take
What's your
take a
question?
200
What's your
my question is over a 250-year period. What was the large? Were Bengal origin Lascars? Were they the largest group of people, or was it Chinese, or were they sort of? Because that sort of.
Let's find out together. If you keep them together, we've got a network of researchers who also look at such questions. I'm sure we can get some baseline on. People know stuff that we can find out. It's not something I have at the tip of my tongue.
But if you haven't looked at that Balachandran book, he does begin some.
I think Balachandran says, if I remember rightly, in his chapter about recruitment, he says at different times, even in the 19th century, even in like the 1870s, 1890s, different decades, you've got different ethnic groups being majority depending on the recruitment practices.
There's one area, the Gujarat famine in 1891, and suddenly the London City Mission Archive records say that the whole the port of London is flooded with Gujaratis and Suratis, and they are all Hindu, and that they don't understand. There's these missionaries going up to them saying "Salam alaikum," and they go, "We don't say that, thanks. That's not our religion." And so it changes, like depending on also what happens back home. Who leaves and who decides to go and take up work depends on things that happen. So it's constantly in flux. It's very.
But just by body count, it seems that the British maritime history is the maritime history of Lascars.
Correct.
If I'm not wrong.
That's the mind-banging.
Balachandran gives a statistic where at the turn of the century, Lascars make up 18.5%, and by 1928 they make up 28%, if I remember correctly.
So I British maritime workforce.
Of the British maritime workforce. So of course there was
World War II, then it's rather that's different, I guess.
I mean, it might be that was a Royal Indian Navy ship because that might be that was quite different and that had a higher proportion. I don't know which.
We can now kind of pick holes in all different things. But I think what I was surprised at coming from a position of complete ignorance was that majority of the people on board the ships weren't people born in white people born in Britain. On those ships, that was not the labour force that was making the British economy work and all these ships go across the globe. That wasn't who was actually, stoking the fires and serving the people. And however, the people, the captains and the officers were white Brits. And in the archives, even in the 1930s, 1940s, the majority of the people who are officers are still. It takes about the 1950s before. Anyway, so you're kind of right, and I like that, but we don't know too much details, and it really depends on the time.
There's another point that I just wanted to make, which kind of linked up your point with your point as well about people being cargo, because another thing that Balachandran writes about is how some people just, they chose to be Lascars in order to travel, in order to get somewhere. So they were working a passage and then they got somewhere, and then they might work a passage to get somewhere. So that's the kind of other interesting aspects of people's lives that we need to kind of find out more about, and hopefully these are some of the things that.
Actually, literature is absolutely. There are some, like in Bengali literature, there are references that I wanted to go there, and then I became a steward in this ship, and then went. So that's definitely true.
And what about songs? That's maybe another area that.
Songs, yeah, exactly. There are very famous songs.
Any other questions?
Not a question. My surname is actually Lascar. I'm of Assam and Sylheti Bangladeshi origin. And I came here today to find out a little bit more about the history of Lascars. I'm not very good with detail, that's why I went to the wrong idea store. So this one, hence me being late. So it's interesting to hear that you're looking at the maritime spin on this. Just in terms of what I know about my background of being a Lascar, a lot of it I learned from Taryn, who's a relative of mine, and she organised a walk around the city of London where we talked, it was a lot about the East India Company and how they went to Calcutta. Yeah, we went on a tea route. So I found it all quite fascinating. It was all very recently. And then I started looking at my own kind of ancestors a bit more, asking my father lots of questions. So my father said to me, he said, and he said this even when I was young, he said we're originally of Persian Saudi descent. So that's where we originally came from. And what I learned after going on this walk was that the term Askari, Lascar, comes from an Arab or Persian word. I think when I was working in the Middle East, they used to use the word al-Askari. So it comes from that term. They tended to be typically they used to have a military background. So in order to sail the seas, you couldn't just be, ordinary Tom, Dick and Harry on the street. You had to be somebody who was quite strong, physically capable, tall, who's very tough, and who can withstand and tolerate the pains and the difficulty of travelling by sea. So that's what I learned a little bit about the history of being Alaska. And so as part of the expansion of the Islamic Empire, they ended up travelling to places like Assam and Bangladesh and those kind of places. But that, from my understanding, that is where the term Lascar came from. So when we talk about Lascars on the ships, and it being quite a slightly pejorative term, from my understanding of it, it's the complete opposite. It's actually quite a revered term, and it signifies that the people are quite strong characters. I'm married to half Afghan Pathan, so there's a lot of war in my family. I'll be fascinated to learn more about the project and to see the angle that you will be coming from.
That suggests that what you're saying suggests that Lascar is almost like an ethnic category.
That's where it derived from, why we decided to label all these natives that were being recruited for their boats. Maybe it seemed like an easy name. Somewhere there was a history behind the labelling of Lascars. That might be quite interesting when the Brits chose that as a name. But then obviously it sounded quite like a nasty one.
I am not an expert in this, but I have a feeling my 18th century friend, my scholarly friend who works at the 18th century, I have a feeling that she told me that it was not a British invention, that was the name they were using for labourers on the ships. I don't know if anyone... Portuguese. Yeah, this is a name that has been around for a long time for people physically working on...
It's like the term sepoy, The British just adapted it, changed it slightly, the sound.
Sorry?
Sepoy?
Soldier.
No, local who joined the British army, they were called sepoys. But the sepoys or sipahis, slightly different name, was they're already there
That's
before.
in the non-commissioned ranks, yeah. Soldiers.
Yeah, it's another point.
I think it's a fantastic project and well done for doing it. It's great to see. I'm just wondering, and partly also what Sarah was saying, I'm just wondering, is there an institutional agenda behind the project in terms of looking at underrepresented? Is it your
This is Tracey, she's the best. I mean, obviously, it's tons of books already been written, there's lots of scholars already working for generations. People like Rosina Visram have already been, looking at this sort of underwritten history, and organisations like this are pretty old-fashioned. They're pretty, the Museum of London, for instance, is a bit ahead. I was doing some work like this in the National Archives about 15 years ago. Lots of people have been doing this stuff. It's just high time that all these institutions started being more reflective of the modern British audiences that are, that own them. So, in as much as that, but it takes someone like Aaron Jaffa, the researcher they were talking about, and now this other lady who's hopefully been, has already been researching in the archives, and all these sort of things to come together, and particularly committed members of staff who actually get stuck in and do the legwork for these moments to bubble up. So hopefully this is one of those moments when you just get a bit of institutional change happening.
At this point, sorry, I just say I would always like to pay homage to Rosina Visram at every opportunity. If you haven't come across her work, she is a woman who's now in her 70s and who was working as a secondary school history teacher in South London, sort of way back in the 1980s, and was so fed up with the fact that there wasn't any British Asian history being taught that she went off and she started doing her initial research that resulted in this book, Ayahs, Lascars and Princes, that was published in 1986. And interestingly, in 1986, there wasn't a huge interest. It was picked up by a few people, but it never went into a second print. And it took her kind of like leaving a job without institutional support, using her teacher's pension to spend all her life in the archives, searching out not just the Lascar histories, but all of the other histories of Asian people in Britain, and then published this amazing book in 2002, Asians in Britain, 400 Years of History, which within a few months went into a second print. And I think a lot of that was to do with just the change of generations. In 1986, nobody was ready for it. No institution was ready for it. Come 2002, a retired school teacher with no support from universities or museums published this amazing book, which has been a fantastic resource for so many people to sort of jump off from. I think her work has begun to be recognised and is now sort of reaching into all of these different areas. And I think she would be really, she is, speaking as if she's not around anymore, she's kind of very, very happy that this kind of work is taking off now.
I suppose it's something like that with Caroline Adams.
Oh, of course, yeah, Caroline.
If it wasn't for her taking all the histories of Bangladeshi seafarers in the 1970s, then we wouldn't have any of the first-hand accounts of Bangladeshi seafarers in East London, and they're detailed stories. There's about 12 of them in across 70s, but then there's also at Tower Hamlets there are all of her papers. So we've got the actual tapes as well, and we've got her transcripts of the long ones that didn't make it into the publication. So, and those are incredibly rich and show a kind of very mobile, diverse, very kind of resourceful generation from the 1920s and 30s. We've got people working as fire wardens during the Second World War because they felt that was part of their kind of duty to Islam to help in the Second World War, and that kind of detail that we wouldn't have otherwise. So that's I would say it's a great book and great work.
I'm sorry,
Yeah, sorry.
the lady in the room.
Well, the first is Rosina Visram, Visram, and the second is Caroline Adams. Yeah.
I raised the question because it's very easy to say going online and stuff. I think the amount of material I have, it's probably not viable to digitize all of that, I suppose.
Wow.
But I'm just sort of asking, one of the things that I noticed, there was a 1947 partition sort of project globally that basically just gives a chance to take oral and sort of contribution, because your exhibit obviously is a physical one. People have to volunteer to go to the museum. But is there an option of, if you have an option of people who are not physically being able to go can contribute in certain ways? More sort of friendly submission system in that sense.
Sorry, I forgot to mention as well, because I was trying to recruit people, come and look at the archive and let's talk. We're actually preparing a digitisation bid at the moment, so we're trying to we can't do absolutely everything because we have to edit, because there's a massive pressure on our people at the museum who do digitisation. So we are aiming that when so we're going to get the materials digitised, but we're aiming for that when we do the catalogue enhancements as well, you've got images of some of the records. But one of my desires is, the Second World War crew list, so we're saying how they didn't record the names and then they did. Well, so those men on those lists, so we've got their names, we've got their father's names, we've got their village, and it's Second World War, so in some cases it'll be within living memory. And one of my ambitions is actually to get those online and just to say, put the invitation out there. Do you know any of these men? Can we find out what, do you have your own memories or records or anything to help tell us more about these men on the ships? And that could go international as well. It's online. It doesn't have to just be people in the southeast of England contributing. So yeah, there is a digitisation plan as well. But we're at the point where I suppose we're in a bit of a bottleneck. We're trying to do everything, aren't we? We're trying to get our projects up and running. We're trying to enhance the catalogue. We're trying to get digital records. Yeah, there is a plan to.
And then some of the really easy stuff like pictures of people on ships.
Once you put things out digitally anyway, and people can view them even though the other work's been taken down. You still get responses via the collections on, we'll still get responses after that. So this is the whole plan about it being a longer term project. It's not just about getting the display and the events running alongside it, it's about having the legacy and the digital side of it.
And I think some of the pictures we've seen are going into, or some of the pictures on here
yes.
are going into, we've got a First World War book that's being published.
Yeah, and I think
These
that picture there, this is an interesting, the poster that some of you may have seen, there's something called the signal log of G. Gibbs, and this was just brilliant when we found it because it was about non-European contributions to the First World War. Now, the most of the people that we found in this particular log are either Chinese or Sikh, but we're just going with it because we just have some really interesting records. They're not staged photographs, and that's what I'm trying to say. So sometimes the stage photographs, they can tell you so much, but actually just seeing the way people work. But again, the interpretation in the scrapbook is done by the G. Gibbs, the commander of the ship. So he's seeing things through a very European point of view. Not only is it going in the book, it's actually going to go in the next Campus Lounge display on First World War Live. So we're trying to represent I can't say it's Lascars in this instance because it's not, but we're trying to make sure that the non-European service
maritime contribution is
recognised.
Are there any more questions?
Just to take on her point, I mean, I work at the BBC. We spent a lot of time for the last 2 years working on World War I stories, and let's say out of 50 stories that we've done, probably just a few would cover native in that language of soldiers who participated. Where I was looking at some records saying, more than 1/3 or Sikhs and other soldiers were part of it. In the same fashion, I think. I mean, this is to use that momentum. I mean, I just feel that would be a very. I mean, this momentum that it's a centenary, but it will continue for at least.
Well, in fact, one of the reasons that I started this project in the first place is that I got in contact with a researcher at the Imperial Museum 2 years ago who'd done a pilot study on their. I can't remember what the title was, but yes, it was basically extra-European people in the First World War, and they'd done a little pilot study before they did their main big one. And having read that, I thought, hey, we might be able to do something at the museum. But of course, the institutional momentum isn't the same here in our museum. We're still quite down with the admirals where we are. So it's taken me and Tracey just going down, and then we have kind of shown there's a justification for why this is an important project. So it's slower and smaller where we are, but it was in fact because of the initial research project that I got in contact with someone that we even started as well. So
Can I just ask you about the new history curriculum in schools and whether or not you're thinking about ways that your material can be used within that?
Okay, so one of the things that I mentioned archive journal boxes before, and the fact that we tend to use those with schools, and we have to have to make them work particularly well for schools. We tend to go for the personal story. So until we find the personal story in the Lascar content, we won't generate an archive journey box. However, I have just finished doing the First World War I archive journey box, which does have some of these First World War I stories from non-European servicemen. If we find the right kind of content to engage the schools in the way that, because we present our school sessions in a particular way. If we find the right material, we'll make sure we have an archive journey box, and then we can add put the other things on that we do for the schools offer. But we just need to find the right thing. Just on another side, I do teach a session on British Empire, and we do look at some of the records, non-European records in that, but we haven't got enough just to do for the way that we teach it. We haven't got enough just to do it from, say, an Asian point of view. It's very, it's just a bit with the more European records. But I mean, this is just the start, really.
I mean, it does kind of link up with what you were saying about the First World War things as well, because I had a daughter who did her history GCSE last year. She goes to Morpeth School, which is probably about 70% Bangladeshi. My husband's from Bangladesh, so she also identifies herself as Bangladeshi. And what was really depressing, although the teaching was fantastic, was just the complete blank of any kind of involvement of people from Bangladesh in anything to do with the First World War. And I'm not saying that it should be celebratory at all, but even looking at any sorts of resistances. So, and I just felt that was really not tackled particularly well within the school. I'm sure it's a story in other schools elsewhere. So I just was wondering whether that was something that you were hoping to be able to impact on the spaces.
We're looking at the cache of Lascar diaries and the human drama and the love letters, but we haven't got it yet.
I don't know if you have to use them from the archive, but there is a autobiography by a Lascar called Chains to Lose, and it's been I think it was written in English because he was educated later on by this guy called Dada Amir Haider Khan.
Right. The point of the archive journal boxes is that when we teach, we teach using originals and we teach using original manuscripts. We don't give people a lesser experience because they're not PhD researchers. They get the real thing. So the thing about the archive journal box is it has to have the real. We don't put facsimiles in. We wouldn't put printed books in as a resource. It has to be the real manuscript because we think that's how. There's got to be a sense of wonder about the objects as well. So it's a good reference that you've given me, but we have a very particular way of setting up those learning experiences at the museum around original material.
Are there any other points?
Yeah. So the volunteers that you're hoping to recruit. So, I know you did mention a little bit before. Just to sort of clarify a little bit more on what specifically, how they can help. You're saying bring your own version of stories or to add to the material that you already have?
Yeah, so it would be we'd basically start by looking through what we have and getting people to discuss the stories that they can actually draw out just by looking at those things, and we'd be recording that. But then we'd probably set some more structured tasks as we go along around how we research particular people and sort of enhancing archive skills, if you like. But it starts off with the conversations about the pieces. So it's not like a school session where we have a very formal session plan. It starts off with a few questions and discussion. And the idea is that because it's an informal learning practice, that it's shaped by the contribution. So that's how we start it. So we are looking for people to come and talk about the things to start with and to answer questions, but also to ask their own questions and to have to start shaping it that way. So we don't follow a very. It's not. I would say it's not like teaching key stage 3 students where you have a very structured plan. We start off in a very open way and see where the conversations take place.
Obviously, we can acquire certain skills like archival skills and research skills.
Yeah, that's one of the things I will be teaching. So for example, when I showed you the Dreadnought Seamen's Hospital register, you're probably aware of the fact that the handwriting is round hand or copper plate. So one of the things I can do to help people is actually teach them how to read old documents because I have that expertise. I can also teach people how to put together family trees and how to make their research viable in that area as well. So I would be giving back, so helping people to develop those skills as well as sort of drawing stories out of you and helping us to interpret and enhance the cataloguing of the collections.
Apparently you should sort this cake.
Oh, it's crazy.
To be carrot cake.
Oh, okay.
Pressure.
Well, that's
the project's going to fail on that.
I could probably offer several types of cake if that's.
We can do it.
Are you able to stay around for a little bit?
Yeah, I want to give these out as well, just so people can see what we do, and also to take mine and Heloise's contact email so that you can get in touch with more questions.
And let's grab a juice and some crisps and we can keep talking.